For the first time ever, I am thrilled to say we have an official sponsor for the Dirt Talk podcast, and that's Ariat. I've worn Ariat boots on every job site I've visited over the years, traveling in them across 5 continents. More importantly, I have yet to find a single project where working folks, unlike me, are not wearing Ariat boots and workwear in every condition imaginable. And there's really good reason for that, and that's because it's phenomenal stuff. And the more I've learned about Ariat and the company, the more I've loved their brand. So with this, Ariat is offering any Dirt Talk listener 10% off their next Ariat order at ariat.com/dirttalk. That's 10% off boots, jeans, and workwear at ariat.com/dirttalk or at the link in this episode's description. With that, let's get to the show. Good day, everybody. Welcome back. Monday episode of the Dirt Talk podcast. I've been reading from a book called The Kiewit Story. Remarkable Man, Remarkable Company, written based on Peter Kiewit. And if you're looking to find the book, good luck. It's a very old book, I believe, from, let me see here. The early 80s, so copyright 1981. Somebody gifted me this book, and I have read it multiple times. It's a spectacular read. So if you can get your hands on a copy, I highly recommend it. But per the internet, it's like a few grand to find a copy. So if you find a copy, good for you. I would read it and then probably sell it. And mine is available for the right offer. So if someone wants to offer me a fine sum of money, you can have this book after I am done reading it. I was not planning. I really enjoy this book. I wasn't planning on reading any of it though. However, there are just some chapters in here that are so cool, and it would be, in my opinion, a disservice not to read from them because, again, they're spectacular, and they talk about the good old days of American engineering, which I have a ton of respect for, and which is the foundation of today's dirt world. So I am going to start out of the book again, The Kiewit Story, Chapter 7, Building on the Ice Cap. And I didn't know any of this was even a thing until I read this chapter. It is absolutely mind-boggling. Military construction was right down Peter Kiewit's alley. His company had built scores of installations during World War II and built them well. Thus, when the Cold War heated up, that, plus this country's participation in the Korean War, and the nation needed more protection against a possible attack over the North Pole by Russia, Peter Kiewit was ready. In 1951, PKS was selected by the government to sponsor a joint venture to build an airbase and anti-aircraft missile system at the high Arctic site of Thule, Greenland. Project known at first only as Operation Blue Jay that required the hiring, training, and transporting of more than 5,000 men and countless shiploads of equipment, materials, and food well above the Arctic Circle. Engineering, planning, procurement, and recruiting proceeded simultaneously with the mobilization of a ship convoy, which rivaled those of war years. The landing was made on the 4th of July at a site equipped with only a temporary airstrip by an early party of pioneers. 90 days later, a 2,400-man city, a 10,000-foot runway, and 2 hangars were in operation. Before the onset of the Arctic night, the tank farm and connecting pipelines were completed. We worked there for nearly 15 years on major military installations of several different types, some of them located far out on the ice cap, said Peter Kiewit. PKS constructed the eastern end of the Distant Early Warning System, radar station, and the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, with radar screens as large as a football field that had to be anchored in the unstable permafrost of an inhospitable environment. This was Santa Claus land without the jingle bells. Navy troop ships and landing ships left over from World War II fought through rough seas, icebergs as big as a city block, freezing winds, and the absence of mail call. Pete Kiewit himself was one of the first to go in, along with famed Arctic explorer Colonel Bernd Balchen, an early advocate of building defense installations on the seemingly impossible snow and ice. The first of the construction men set sail in the early summer of 1951, and almost immediately there was trouble. The convoy was only a few miles from the job site when it had to retreat in the face of heavy ice floes which filled Baffin Bay. Navy icebreakers and demolition crews swept the channel clear, and the construction men sailed in, to learn to their considerable pleasure that mess crews had been flown in ahead of time and were waiting for them with hot meals. Project Blue Jay was a joint venture involving S.J. Groves & Sons and Al Johnson Construction Company, Inc. of Minneapolis, as well as PKS and another Omaha partner, Condon Cunningham, Inc., headed by Chet Cunningham, an old friend and colleague of Pete's. The foursome was known as North Atlantic Constructors, with PKS the sponsoring company, and as such, the one that ran the entire 15-year show. PKS operated first out of New York City and later Trenton, New Jersey. Ships sailed out of Norfolk, Virginia, while another North Atlantic Constructors installation was located at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts for the necessary airlifting of men and materials. Peter Kiewit went in and out by air. Once he flew in with a bunch of USO entertainers, and he wasn't always on the typical Pete Kiewit schedule. If a storm hit while he was there, and it often did, he might be 3 or 4 days waiting for transportation out again. Such delays weren't to his liking, but they were part of Operation Blue Jay. Operation Blue Jay was something brand new in the construction industry, something never tried before. To marshal a small army of volunteer craftsmen, ship them off to a hostile and faraway country, and install the complicated, sophisticated equipment and facilities needed to fight a modern war. It was 20th century technology in a Stone Age setting. PKS was up to it. Pete Kiewit started by naming George Halling project manager, and Halling immediately left the Omaha home office to set up shop in New York City. The logistics of the project were staggering. Every bit of organization, every piece of material, the entire system of recruitment had to start from scratch. And this was at a period in American history when the nation was mobilizing again for Korea after the hasty demobilization following World War II. While Halling began to get things moving in New York City, other PKS personnel established the recruiting and training encampment at Rosemount, Minnesota. Most of the craftsmen who agreed to go to Greenland came from the upper Midwest, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, with a liberal sprinkling of other Midwesterners from Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, and even further south. There was no misrepresentation about their working conditions. They were told of the hardships they would have to endure, but the compensation, plus the challenge, were great enough to make them willing, even eager to go. Before we began sending people in, there was nothing but a small Eskimo village and a weather station operated by the government of Denmark, said Halling. The island was a part of Denmark, and Danish officials played a role in all of the activity up there. The first men to arrive lived aboard their ships for almost 40 days while the construction camp was being built. Fortunately, mail had preceded them, and mail call was one of their first enjoyments, and one of the only ones of that summer. They had left families and girlfriends behind. Ultimately, they were to organize such typically military diversions as pool halls, metalwork, and leathercraft hobby shops, a band, language classes, a gymnasium, USO entertainment, a newspaper and radio station with its own disc jockey, but those amenities were to come later. In the beginning, there was work, eat, and sleep, and because of the perpetual sunlight of the Arctic summer, sometimes the sequence of those three activities got mixed up. Harry Sal, later a lead engineer estimator at the Home Office, spent 2 seasons at Greenland. He explained the confusion about working schedules. My shift was, well, stateside you would call it the night shift, but there was no such thing up there as day and night. We worked around the clock, 7 days a week, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Now, a 12-hour shift in itself is tiring, but the first season we didn't have enough common sense to go to bed right after work because the sun was still up. We'd get off work at 6 a.m., and because the sun was out, we'd get started on a softball game, and first thing we know, it was noon, and we were due back to work in 6 hours. So the next season, we brought shades and curtains to hang up over the windows so we could get some sleep. The initial housekeeping provisions called for the men to live in tent-like huts, but before the huts could be constructed, the men lived on their Navy transports out in the icy waters, ferrying to land each shift and returning at the end of the shift. The landing craft had to be guided through the floating icebergs. The huts consisted of a plywood deck and wood ribs with heavy insulated canvas atop that base. Each hut had a space heater, and it was needed. In summer, the temperature averaged about 40 degrees, maybe rising to 60 above at midday, but falling back below the freezing mark at night. In winter, the thermometer read a numbing 60 below zero. The port was ice-free for 6 to 8 weeks a year, so all the heavy equipment had to be scheduled for loading and transportation via ship to hit that time window. Foodstuffs, personnel, and spare parts could be airlifted, but not a crane. The military was in charge of air transportation, and there were other military priorities, including the Berlin airlift at one time and the Korean War at the beginning. So not all calls for aircraft by North Atlantic constructors could be met, and once PKS had to charter some airplanes from the Slick and Flying Tigers charter services. Despite the personal hardships, many workers kept coming back year after year. Some people get used to that offshore type living, said Ron Smathers, now PKS Home Office Administrative Manager who worked out of the Trenton, New Jersey office several years during Blue Jay. They accept the isolation in order to save a lot of money. One fellow bought a bank after his days in Greenland were over. Hauling had one early problem to solve, and Peter Kiewit helped him. An admiral was in command of the original sea operation to supply Greenland, and shortly after he had delivered his first convoy, the admiral decided to steam to the comfortable Caribbean Sea and participate in a Navy exercise. I got a hold of Pete in a hurry, and he contacted General Pick. I don't know who all they talked to, but the admiral reversed himself, and the Navy stayed with us to help get things organized, said Halling. By September, when Halling made his first on-site inspection, a number of barracks buildings were finished, and the men had just moved into their new mess hall. The sun was going round and round, 24 hours a day, said Halling. By October, when I went up again, the sun hung on the southern horizon for maybe 4 hours a day. That's how fast the seasons would change. By the onset of really bad weather, North Atlantic constructors had a hangar erected and a crew stayed all winter working inside. In later years, the work shifts were cut from the emergency 12 on, 12 off to 10-hour days, partly because of the lower productivity in the longer shift. That first summer, we probably only got 60% productivity after the first month or two, said Sal. You just couldn't work those hours and put out the way you should. Sal and other supervisors would stay there until about the 1st of December, then go to the winter camp at Rosemount, returning the next March to get things started for the work crew's arrival. At Rosemount, planning would go on, as well as recruitment for the next season. The first season was rough, living in those canvas huts, said Sal. Every morning, the bucket of water in your hut was frozen. I don't think anybody ever walked around without a wool shirt. But after we began moving the men into the barracks, our first priority, it wasn't so bad. In the first season, PKS people and their partners built the military base with living quarters, landing and maintenance facilities capable of handling the largest planes of the U.S. Air Force. The second season saw the completion of the base to accommodate all normal flight operations. And in 1953, the finishing touches were completed and all facilities expanded. By this time, there was a chapel, complete with clergymen, and an infirmary with a physician and dentist. By 1956, Pete Kiewit had talked the government into changing the method of contracting the project. Originally, the North Atlantic Constructors joint venture had been selected by the military, with PKS handpicked as sponsor, and the work was done on a cost-plus fixed-fee basis. Pete Kiewit was confident that the government could save money. and he could win the contract if it were changed to a competitive bidding, fixed-price basis. He was right. He changed the name of the contracting organization to Greenland Constructors, and they worked in harmony with a group of Danish firms known as Danish Arctic Contractors at Thule and Sandestrom down the coast at the Arctic Circle. Greenland Contractors in 1956 paved a large airfield apron, widened and surfaced the shoulders of taxiways and runways, and added more buildings. Between 1957 and 59, the Nike system, which consisted of anti-aircraft missiles, was constructed. By 1959, operating alone as PKS, the company's Eastern District was awarded a contract to construct 2 radar stations as part of the easterly extension of the DEW line. These stations were located several hundred miles inland from the Greenland coast at 7,400 feet above sea level, adding to the logistics complications. But by this time, PKS people felt at home on the ice cap. Because the subsurface material is ice and snow several thousands of feet deep, the footings for the radar stations were structural steel grills sunk some 20 feet below the snow's surface. These grills supported huge steel columns from which the buildings were suspended by jacks. As the snow built up, an estimated 5 feet a year, the buildings were jacked up on the columns to keep them above the surface. Because of the distance inland, the stations were supplied entirely by air, using a fleet of C-130s equipped with special skis. BMEWS, designed for detection only, was finished in 1963. Greenland duty was difficult, but it was fun. I had never seen an Eskimo with a dog team before, said Smathers, but he was probably as surprised to see me as I was to see him. There wasn't much free time, and there wasn't that much to see, but we did go sightseeing. Greenland had its own stark beauty, but some of the men couldn't take the isolation. A few had to be sent home for psychiatric care. But all in all, it worked out pretty well. Indeed, it did. So well, in fact, that when Thule was completed, a Pentagon spokesperson said to Pete Kiewit and his colleagues, "You have not only saved America money, you may have saved America." But in an unfriendly world, with the Russian bear dedicated to dominating the world, no system of saving America remains intact forever. And PKS was involved in preparing air bases and silos for the newest Department of Defense methods of forestalling the bear. PKS built 3 SAC bases in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. And as the decade of the 50s gave way to the 60s and America's system of retaliatory defense added missiles to its arsenal, Pete Kiewit brought Bob Wilson back to the Omaha headquarters as his personal assistant and assigned Wilson the job of getting into the missile business. PKS built Titan missile facilities at Beale Air Force Base near Marysville, California, some $55 million worth, but the big emphasis in America's defense was on the Minuteman, named in honor of the American Revolutionary War private citizen who kept himself armed and ready to jump to his country's cause at a minute's notice. The Minuteman was a big fellow, about 56 feet tall, ready to travel more than 6,000 miles at speeds up to 15,000 miles per hour, developing a nuclear warhead packing a wallop the equivalent of 500,000 tons of TNT. It was the nation's first land-based missile of the compact, solid-fueled, instant-firing variety, and the project was marked urgent. Wilson got busy learning all about missiles and put together an estimating team. PKS had never built missile silos before, and Pete Kiewit was reluctant to get into a business he did not have experience with, but this was different. PKS had the experience to do all the things that missile site construction required. Mostly, it consisted of digging holes, and we had dug holes before, said Wilson. It required lots of excavation and lots of fabricated steel. It was a logistical and organizational job more than anything else. PKS was an unsuccessful bidder on a Minuteman project in Missouri. Then in quick order, it was low bidder on 2 contracts in the upper Midwest to build 150 silos and 15 launch control structures, each at Ellsworth Air Force Base near Rapid City, South Dakota, and the Minot, North Dakota Air Force Base. Dick Lucan's Eastern District was assigned to Minot, and George Holling, who had long since left his Greenland responsibilities, was sent to Rapid City, with the Sheridan, Wyoming district also playing a part. The contract at Rapid City was for $73 million, at Minot for $90 million, and each was given a deadline 18 months away. "We didn't have any cost experience for this work," said Wilson. "We engineered the estimates." In other words, the estimates were theoretically based on similar excavation and steelwork in the past. Most of the guesswork involved the fact that there would be a total of 330 sites spread across 20,000 square miles of Dakota prairie. Crews and work schedules had to be worked out in meticulous detail, and crew foremen had to be given considerable responsibility and trust. The project at Rapid City was first to get underway in July of 1961, with completion due early in 1963. The basic pattern of construction, simplified, began with excavation and grading at each location, followed by shaft excavation, a circular hole 16 feet in diameter extending to a depth of 82 feet below the surface of the ground. The heavily reinforced deflector pad, destined to withstand the blast of the launch, was poured at the bottom of the shaft, and the can was lowered into place. The can is the 25-ton heavy-gauge steel liner that forms the walls of the silo and within which the missile sits for launching. A 12-inch wall of concrete was then poured around the outside of the steel liner, with a reinforced concrete equipment room constructed atop the silo, plus a small concrete support building. This is all below the surface. Only the heavy concrete closer door is visible on the surface, the door that is slid open and when the missile must be launched. M.W. Budd was one of the engineers. Everything was organized on the assumption that the job would go well until someone hollered for help, he said. Then help would come. I came to work every morning to find a list of things that had to be done that day, write down the sheet of paper. There was a separate crew for each operation. A subcontractor would dig the basic hole, then move to another site to dig another basic hole. A second crew would move in behind to drill the shaft, then move out. A third crew would bring in the reinforced steel and pour the deflector pad, and another crew would install the steel liner. The size of a crew varied considerably with the complexity of its job. Some were as small as 4 men, some numbered up to 30. Whatever the size, each had to do its particular function in one working day and move on. Some of the men who had worked in Greenland complained about the bitter Dakota winter. The winds were what made the working conditions so miserable. And in summer, Great Plains thunderstorms would sweep across the land, filling the holes with water. Bethlehem Steel set up a fabricating plant near Minot and transported the steel to the sites on huge tractor-trailer units that crawled across the rolling prairies. Bethlehem workers went on strike for a time, and PKS people began to worry about meeting their contract completion date agreements, but the strike was settled and work resumed. When problems developed, it wasn't long before Pete Kiewit was on the scene if his presence was needed. He was always where the trouble was, said Bud. He never ran and hid. The crewmen lived in the small towns in the missile site area. Each crew was completely self-sufficient, equipped with whatever equipment it needed for as long as it was going to need it. All deadlines were met. The nation's defenses were bolstered as Boeing moved in with the missiles and the Air Force moved in with crews to operate them, and PKS left, knowing that its contribution was a success and that its engineered estimates had provided the employee stockholders with a fair profit. Later on in the decade of the 1960s, PKS won 2 contracts to update a large number of Titan missile sites. The first sites in California, Colorado, Idaho, South Dakota, and Washington, and the second for sites in Arkansas, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, South Dakota, and Washington. The Corps of Engineers was highly pleased with the PKS performance and presented the company a certificate of appreciation for patriotic civilian service for completing high-risk work in severely restricted space with limited access and strict security limitations using top-quality craftsmen and technical talent. Although the work was successfully completed over 3 months ahead of schedule at an estimated savings of $825,000 to the government, the company met or exceeded safety and security standards, demonstrating a high degree of managerial and technical competence, knowledge, and leadership. Pete Kiewit's determination to get into the missile business had paid off. In 1975, when he was awarded the Distinguished Nebraskan Award by the Nebraska Society of Washington, D.C., he commented, "As I look back on it, I think our company has succeeded primarily because we recognized and we were prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that existed even during times of adversity. In a similar way, our nation has achieved prosperity and indeed greatness by meeting challenges and reacting to hard times." I am going to stop there. There are some other stories within this book that are quite fascinating. If you enjoyed this, let us know. Message me online or write to us at dirttalk@billwood.com. If you did enjoy it and want to hear more, perhaps I read another chapter sometime in the future. But until then, that is all I anticipate from this book, The Kiewit Story. I am a huge fan of Kiewit. I'm a former Kiewit employee and will always be a fan of Kiewit, even if they don't let me onto their job sites. Maybe one day they will. Pete Kiewit, the guy's a legend and one of, I would say, the founding fathers of the modern day industry in America. So I loved reading about how he got started and how he built Kiewit into what it is today, one of the biggest contractors in the world. So, thanks as always for listening, for sharing, and we'll see you on the next one. Stay dirty.